We are MythVision. Welcome to MythVision, your host Derek Lambert. I have a special guest slash host of his own YouTube channel. And Joel Pearson, how are you?
All right. I usually do religious debate videos, but I like history as well. So the historicity of Jesus is something that kind of crosses over both religion and history.
Totally agree, brother. So we'll dive right into this. Everybody who's watching this, be sure to go down in the description. You're going to see his YouTube channel. Go like and subscribe. He brings awesome content. I really enjoy Joel, and he's part of a lot of Facebook groups. So if you enjoy these discussions and you have a Facebook, add yourself to these groups if you're a heretic like we are. Just saying. I think it'll be fun. Hope to see you there and enjoy this video. All right, let's dive right into it, brother. So for those of us who were coming over to this, I guess you'd say they're going to consider, what is mythicism, number one? Can you tell me what it is?
It's just the idea that there was no single figure called Jesus who actually was crucified and started the cult of Christianity. So they could easily have been based on multiple Jesuses, different stories, and stitched together over time. But if you look at the earliest account that we have of Christianity, which is Paul's epistles, then there doesn't seem to be any actual real Jesus in there. It's all visions, and Paul never says he ever met anyone who was an actual Jesus. He only talks about Jesus appearing in visions. So the idea of mythicism is that Paul was telling the truth about that, and that there wasn't actually a Jesus there to begin with. It was only in his head, and it was in the heads of all the other Christians at the time, the cult that he joined.
Yeah, I totally agree. I mean, the one that really matters to any Christian today isn't the real guy necessarily, as much as they want to use that a part of their creeds and stuff. That's why I really enjoy like Dr. Bob and Richard Carrier, Dr. Carrier. They bring some interesting things here. And what I would say in all of this is when you start to challenge the text and you start to become more of a skeptic in terms of, well, I doubt, even if you're a believer, you start to doubt and go, what is going on here? This doesn't make sense in real world history. It doesn't add up. Maybe these are contradictions. Maybe there is legitimate reasons. We need to check this text out. I started looking at them, and I think what really got me was a lot of this is synchronistic mythology that I did see elements of it in other mythologies. And when I started looking at these other mythologies and saying, okay, there are elements, not saying they're verbatim or anything like an identical copy, like what we see in the zeitgeist, which gives a bad name for us who consider mythicism. When we say we're mythicists, we're not a movement necessarily. What we're saying is we're skeptics. We're guys who really doubt that we have accurate information through the ages that are telling us this guy was a real guy on earth based off the evidence we have. We don't have sufficient evidence to say, here he is. No, this is him. He was he was a gentle, kind, pay to Caesar Jew. Oh, no. That's why we have the Brandon version. He was a militant radical. Oh, no. He was actually, his mother was raped by a Roman soldier, and he was born. Oh, no. And on it goes. So I started to question things, and just like you, ended up seeing that, man, there could have been one. There could have been a guy. We just don't have very good evidence to say, for a fact, this is who he is.
Yeah, I think that's a really good way of putting it, is that there isn't a consensus on Jesus, where the idea is, oh, there's a consensus that Jesus existed and mythicists are the minority. Well, no, there's many different Jesuses that are argued. So the idea that a Jesus existed, which Jesus? So there isn't really a solid consensus. There's so many different kinds of Jesus. And people sort of read their own bias into him when they're going to discover the history. And it is something that I found interesting when I was a believer. And as I started to realize more and more of that wasn't true, I then decided to go and find the real Jesus. And once you start digging, you realize, well, this is myth, that is myth. Like Aaron Ra pointed out that the story of Noah was ripped off from Gilgamesh. It was an Pishtim, I think. And you start to see more and more parallels where the Bible has just taken older stories and converted them. So yeah, we find that with Jesus as well. The Gospels in particular are just full of myths. They even take elements from Homer. So yeah,
Yeah, the
obviously not
Homeric
history, but
epics.
yeah. So
Good.
when you start pulling on that, then suddenly you find there's no Jesus left. It just unravels.
And that's kind of like where I'm at with it. I guess I'm brainstorming with you here as we record because it to me when you start peeling away the onion, as Dia Murdoch's even said before she died, she used to say when you peel away the onion, could there be things left? Yeah, but what we can't substantiate what is matter of fact left that we know for certain existed. I mean, I had a recent interview we just did with Eisenman and Lawson, Christopher Lawson and Professor Eisenman. And what I found interesting is both men believe there was a guy named Jesus. As soon as Lawson, and now Lawson's a student of his work, but he also veers off in his own position on Jesus and such, and does in-depth research trying to discover who the guy really was. As soon as he did, Eisenman went, Now, Eisenman's really hard to deal with sometimes, okay? He's very, But he cut him off and was like, we can't know nothing about this guy. Stop. Like he pretty much didn't want to go there because he's like, where are you finding, what's your source? You can't go to that source. Tell me what you know about him. That's why his case was, whatever you know about James, of course, he titled his book, James, the brother of Jesus, when the text says the brother of the Lord. And that's a whole nother rabbit trail I just interviewed Dr. Price on right before I'm talking to you. And I don't want to get into that rabbit trail, but the bottom line is he makes a case that it is plausible that it is not biological and that this is a part of a movement. And Lawson just stopped, out of respect because the way Eisenman came about it. But Eisenman, in one sense, is saying, here, you want to know Jesus? Look at James. But how do you know that? What if this James movement, if there was a James, was usurped by a Herodian type of people who concocted if that is the idea that this is a brother of Jesus, they take the movement away from a James type guy and they slap the movement on a fictional brother of this guy that's supposedly before him and make a movement around this Joshua type named Jew. I mean, I'm just speculating, but we can't be certain and we should have doubts. We should be like, you know what? What if? We should be able
Well,
to
yeah,
say what if.
because James is also supposed to be the brother of John.
And is this the same John that's supposedly the beloved disciple?
Well, he wasn't, but
Yeah, we need to speculate on that, right? Because it's probability. That's what we always hear. And you actually have been great in my journey on this because you've actually given me materials that I need to look at and saw things from a new perspective when I saw your material on YouTube. And that's why I keep telling people go over there and check you out because you look at things a little different. You take what the scholars are saying, you dissect it down, and then you give a little bit of your own perception on it. And it helped me kind of see things in a way that if I didn't understand it from them, you made it make sense for me.
well, people understanding things best narratively, I find. So when you get sunk down into the details and the facts, then quite often you can just, like you say, go down a rabbit hole. And then you can sort of lose the big picture as you do that. So it helps to keep things in perspective at the top level. In particular, the fact that we don't really know what the original text said. And that's always worth keeping in mind, especially when we start arguing over the finer points of grammar in a particular word. It's like, well, that could easily have been a mistake at some point or just added in by someone else. We really can't trust the text that we have. So we have to step back and say, well, what's the general gist of these texts? What parts do we know were added in later? So what do we have left after you take all those pieces out?
It's
And you also have to consider the reasoning behind it. You say, as Ehrman says, what's the most difficult reading of the text? If you've got a variant, then somebody's changed it to make it easier for their theology. So clearly the original harder reading, like when in Mark, Jesus got angry, and later on they changed that and made him not angry. Clearly Jesus getting angry is more embarrassing, so that was the original reading. And then someone simplified it to make the later version of Jesus fit with that, like the John's Jesus.
I totally agree. In fact, that's why I've been encouraging you. I'm like, you got to get Dr. Bob's book because I know you'll be able to digest it better than I will. I told him to please make it in audio format. The Colossal Apostle. Did you get it?
don't have the Colossal Apostle yet. I am reading The Incredible Shrinking Son of Man, though.
That's awesome, man. Yeah, he's fascinating. He says that exactly what you said. Okay, he takes things. They call him a hypercritic, but seriously, shouldn't you be? I mean, really, think about this. Shouldn't you be hypercritical about this? Shouldn't you say, we shouldn't quite trust all of this, and then work your way in on what you can truly substantiate and then work inward? It seems like there's two sides of this candle: the side of historicity they start burning, and the side of skepticism. When you actually start finding all these problems in the candle, do you start with, I'm going to start with it's real and then find what's not and throw that out? Or do you start with, maybe this thing is really not to be trusted to start with, and work on what we can solidify? Isn't that a proper method when you have a book that's been so messed with and so played with throughout the ages? Don't you think we should go, okay, hocus pocus, let's find what's real and work your way inward? I mean, for crying out loud, we have a majestic celestial Jesus that's believed to this day, who's like Santa Claus answering prayers. This was mentioned by Dr. Bob about his Jesus Christ Superstition book. He's answering everybody's prayers all at once, just like Santa's going in all the chimneys in all the world to get you your gifts. Why not start with, what if this is mythology? What if this has been edited, played with, and then work your way inward? And his book, The Colossal Apostle, he makes a case that even the epistles of Paul are patchworks that have been redacted, edited, forged, added on, and that Marcion's debating with one of the church fathers right there at the beginning. And it's like Galatians chapter 3 did not have what it has today in it in certain spots, Dr. Bob says, that it's actually attacking Marcion's theology. And Marcion is the first guy who's originally finding these things and never mentions this, and neither does the church father. So I don't know the argument, but why not start there and work out, you know?
Yeah, it is quite suspicious, just the way that the first canon was a heretical canon, and later on canons, just did away with that. So it's quite interesting. You can never say that the Christianity we have now is the original one, because it's been chopped and changed so many times. And I think what we get with Paul's works, the way they've been edited, what's really odd is on the historicity versus mythicism debate, we know Paul's epistles have been tampered with, because obviously he wrote a lot that he no longer survives. There's lots of strange jumps. And so you have to consider, what's more likely, that the historicist sect that survived cut out loads of historical information, or the historicist sect that survived cut out all the mythical information to make it match? Because once you get to the Gospels, you've got a historical Jesus. So if Paul's letters didn't fit that, then obviously they're going to go back and only preserve the parts of Paul's letters that fit their theology. So yeah, it's very odd. In particular, it's very strange when people who don't believe that Jesus was mythical, that he was a historical person, they argue as if we would expect to find explicit references to mythicism in Paul's letters if that was the case, because no, they would chuck it out. It would become heresy.
Yeah, I do get it. They want it to be like, I think that could be our I guess you'd say, the methodology of Protestantism in the way we research, because the text should tell you, right? Sometimes the text tells you, but it doesn't tell you. And I try to explain this to a lot of people who are part of our groups that we're involved in, that espouse doctrines that you have to try and deduce, and you have to try to make sense of, and you have to make all the books say the same thing for it to make sense. And so I try to explain that to them, why I don't follow completely. Is it possible that some of the doctrines they're saying are true, or maybe being used here? Probably in the earliest forms of these texts, yes. However, we don't have the earliest forms, and to act like this is going to get handed off into literal pagans' hands, and they're not going to do something about it, I just don't buy that. So with what you're saying, they say stuff like, these are not cleverly devised myths. Dr. Price always says, I love. Why are you saying that? Who's saying that they're cleverly devised myths? Or, I'm not a liar. Was someone being called a liar? Possibly. Another way to look at it is, if you know how what I love about Dr. Bob, the Christ myth, and his theories and the problems with it, right? So his book, The Christ Myth Theory and Its Problems, he shows Old Testament stories in the New Testament, showing why they don't make sense historically. Like, dude, this is just a rewrite of that. That's literally all. Maybe certain circumstances and situations change because it's a different context, but they're rewriting that story. And when you follow that logic and you start looking at this and you go, okay, who's Paul? If you did use that information, you'll find that Paul, in many ways, squares up with Balaam, the prophet, who's giving these false prophecies in the Old Testament. And you kind of go, hold on, is this a narrative? Like, is this history? Is it? We can't get past that part if you're really a skeptic and really trying to tie in what's going on here. You could assume, but I think we should start here and work this way and not start with, yep, this is all legit, and work inward. And Price does that with Paul as well.
Well, so when you mentioned in Second Peter the cleverly devised myth lines, what's really interesting about that is then they immediately forge an eyewitness testimony afterwards. So you can see they're literally fabricating stories about Jesus. Because of course we know that Second Peter wasn't written by the same person as First Peter, and we're not even sure that that one was genuine. So it's a double forgery, really. But when it comes to the historicity of Paul, for the sake of argument, I grant that, because we have 6 or 7 letters written by probably the same person who we may as well call Paul. So I think it's probably best to start at that position, and then we can argue historicity back and forth, assuming there was a Paul. Maybe that's something which could be argued. I haven't actually read Price's argument in the Colossal Apostle about that, so I still need to get around to that. But for the moment, I'm granting historicity of Paul. And one of the things that I try and do is make sure that I challenge mythicism as much as I challenge historicity. In that I spend some of my time debunking bad mythicists. So when somebody says there's a 100% chance Jesus was mythical and there's no chance at all that he was historical, I have to challenge that as well. I go, well, no, the evidence that we have means you can't make that stronger conclusion in either direction. You have to say it's possible either way. There could have been a historical Jesus, and as Dr. Bob says, maybe there's nothing left of him now. So even if there was a historical Jesus, what we have left in these scraps just doesn't contain any of him. But either way, you can't say 100% there was or wasn't. So it's best to start off in the middle and just go, I don't know. And then you can lean on the side of more skeptical when the evidence demands it, and more towards historicity when the evidence supports that as well. So, like, the brother of the Lord passage is probably the best thing that we've got for historicity. I think it's ambiguous, and the rest of Paul, once you take that into account, it falls apart, because there's no other reference really that supports anything that would be a historical person, and so many references that don't make sense if there was a historical person. Like saying born of a woman is a really weird thing to say about a real person.
Why would you say that?
It's
that's
like,
a good.
what was the alternative?
He was born of a guy. I mean, a donkey shat him out. I mean, what happened? Oh, well, by the way, guess what? He was born of a woman. Did you know that?
I'm going to start introducing my friends that way.
Yeah. Oh, meet
Hi.
Tom. He was born of a woman, in case you're wondering. Come here, buddy. It's like ridiculous, bro. No.
So when you consider what are the odds that somebody would be introduced that way if they were a real person,
that's a good.
It's very
point.
unusual.
Good point. And I mean, look, using the methodology that they would say he was a mythologized person, we're not ruling out the possibility here. I mean, obviously, you need to keep that door open always. But the thing is, when you look at that, it makes you kind of wonder what the motives of the authors are, or at least whoever the editors may have been, because we don't even know. That's how crazy hardcore this is. We don't know what really is the closest to original or not. We can see things that seem like they're edited later, like there's additions, and they're purposely trying to, what we do today, apologetics. They're using their own apologetic methods, except they're almost like, I remember listening to David Wood, who's a Christian apologist, who's arguing against Muslims, and he debates Muslims all the time, and he makes the point that in the Muslims' books, they have this place where it's like, well, you can lie for Allah. You can lie on his behalf as long as it benefits the faith, you know? And it almost makes you think these Christian authors thought the same thing. This needs to be lied for to benefit the faith. If you have to make up an argument, you have to make up something to try and get your point across so that people would come, do it. And I don't know, it just makes you kind of wonder, what are the motivating factors for making up
Well,
born of a
that
man?
was definitely that was Eusebius's attitude, very much in favor of lying for the church. Obviously, writing the Testimonium Flavianum,
right?
Forgery on behalf of God.
That's an interesting point, too, the Flavianum. I mean, they say there's 2 quotes. What do you think about the other quote? Not the one that's clearly putting him as, if you could even call him a man. What about the other one that seems more like he may have been a man who existed? What do you think about that?
Well, I'm sure James did exist. That particular James, obviously, not the one in the Gospels. But then that's the thing. So it says that there was a Jesus and a James. It mentions the Jesus twice. It mentions that Jesus is a high priest, and it does say called Christ. To be fair, that could be an interpolation, because this was Origen's text that Eusebius had, and that we now is the only one surviving for all of us. So I think it's possible that that was a margin written by Origen, a comment written by Origen saying maybe this was the brother of Christ. But I think it's also possible that Josephus actually wrote called Christ because it just means anointed, and the high priests were anointed. So it's entirely in keeping with the Jesus that's in that passage. But if you look at the context of it, then of course it's saying James was killed, and in apology to their father, Jesus was made the high priest. There's only one Jesus in the passage.
And technically, I heard, I think Dr. Bob and Carrier mention that we're not even sure this is the same James and Jesus, because there were many Jesuses and James that were taking place in the first century, and this one sounds to be around the 60s, not placed under Pontius Pilate, which is very confusing, because then you're like, hold on, but Tacitus quotes that Chrestus, and that's under Pontius Pilate. How do you have a Jesus under Pontius Pilate, and you have a Jesus in the war times of the 60s, 2 different guys with... It's very, very controversial. So.
Well, the Tacitus one has forgery in it as well. You can even see where the Christians tampered and changed the letter, so it says Christians instead of Christians. And of course, Chrestus was a slave name, so and it phrases it in such a way that this Chrestus who's leading the revolt is in Rome. So yeah, it falls apart on multiple levels. That. Not to mention, both Josephus and Tacitus, even if they were genuine, would still be hearsay about Christians.
Right. Someone told them what they told them a story about this is technically.
Yeah, they're both what Christians believe. They're not what actually happened in history. They weren't eyewitnesses. They're too late and they're too far removed.
Interesting. Yeah, I think being a doubter is a good thing in this. I surely don't feel threatened. I don't feel like God's mad at me if there is one just because of this. In fact, if he pops up right now and he were to literally reveal his hands and his side wound and feet to me as he did Thomas, according to the tale, I'd have to say I'd go a step further than what I've heard other atheists to argue with Christians. And they're like, well, if he would appear to you right now and show these things to you, would you believe? And they're like, well, I don't know. No, I'm going to be honest. I would believe, okay? I really would. If he appears to me and I didn't take any drugs and I was able to somehow have multiple people around me, okay, because I wasn't hallucinating or tripping, I would believe it. But man, why are those stories even needing to be put in there? It's just, to me, when you start to really look at it from a different angle, I used to be in the box drinking the Kool-Aid and thinking of this and defending it from a purely subjective faith-based type position, and there was no proving me otherwise. Something clicked in my mind, something changed, so I know what it's like to be on that end. I don't want to be a cynical douchebag towards those of faith. And that is not at all my goal, because I know very many people, they tell me all the time they're praying for me. And I thank them, because I know that means they care for me. They just want what's best for me, that type of thing. I take the motives, right? The good motives. But what flipped? Something flipped, and now I can analyze the text and go, why is Thomas having to be revealed these things? And why is the text doing that? And then it follows up with, but blessed are those who don't see, yet still believe. Hold on. We should do what Jesus said. That's the best thing. Believe and not see, and then we're the greatest of Christians, you know? Those are the ones we want to get our blessings, you know?
Yeah, I think the flip is when you start to decide that you care more about whether it's true than whether it's comforting. That's the bit when you start to get curious and go, well, is it actually true? And once you start digging, of course, once you start practicing sound logic and understanding epistemology, that's when it all starts to unravel, because then you realize that faith is entirely dishonest. Once you've made that realization, I mean, you'd never go back to it again.
Mm.
But just on the subject of narrative and the origins of Christianity, it's quite interesting to think about what each author was thinking as they wrote and how they came up with these things. So obviously the gospel authors were arguing with each other and trying to rewrite Jesus in their own way. You can see their own motives coming across in there. Mark didn't have anyone to argue against because he wrote the first gospel that we know of. So, and also it's worth remembering that these aren't the only gospels. There's at least 40 that we know of. So they were competing not just against each other, but against all the other gospels as well.
Yeah, I heard a total of 83. I heard. I don't know if that's true, but and I mean
Possibly
this counts
in
all
mentions and modern ones, yeah.
Right. That means like we're talking third, second, third, fourth century later on. You know, different variety, Gnostic gospels, you name it. But
even 19th, 20th century potentially. I think if you're going to get up to that number,
right. Yeah, I don't know where to stand on some of this stuff because it seems like, and you can probably better answer this, and maybe I should ask some of the more the PhDs in the field of mythicism this question, but it seems to boil down to archons are either leaders in the real world that are crucifying a guy named Jesus, all right, and Christians want to make it like most of the time, and those who may be historians, okay, the historicist, I mean. They make it seem like what's more plausible. You know, they act like the fact that there were real crucifixions that are actually going on during this time, and you're going to take it from this real world where real stuff's going on, you're going to take it somewhere else. That seems implausible, and that kind of tugs at me a little. It does make me kind of go, you know, they got a point. There's a lot of real crucifixions that are really going on during this time. At the same time, you know, is it the archons being these real people? Or is it the archons being these demons, angels, possibly some metaphysical beings taking place in a celestial realm in a way, like Carrier has brought up the Doherty Thesis? Is that what's going on? What have you done in your mind?
It could be both, to be fair, because even if Jesus was crucified, and existed and was crucified by the Romans, then from the theological perspective, it was still the Romans being influenced by the archons, Satan and the demons and so on, because it's a theological thing that's happening. So on the theory that there was a historical Jesus, the reason that all this theology was invented around him was that the cult was reeling from his loss, either as the leader or one of their most respected members, potentially, for them to revere him like that. And then someone like, say, Cephas, Peter, would take over the cult after that point. They'd sort of, they'd go away, go into hiding, think about what had happened, find a way to fit it into their worldview, because of course they can't be wrong. Their God still has to exist. They still have to be on the right path. So then they managed to twist that in and rewrite their theology to fit what happened. So that does require them to switch from one leader to another, which is less likely than just carrying on with the same leader. So on the other, the mythicist hypothesis, or at least the one that I think is likely, then you have Peter there being the leader all along, right from the beginning. There was never Jesus countering him, fighting with him for leadership. And in this scenario, he has the idea of having a sacrifice. Now, whether he genuinely believed it or not, we don't know. We have nowhere near enough information to say with any certainty. But in some way, through reading scriptures, through seeing these crucifixions of other rebels, and it doesn't have to be Jesus that was crucified, just the fact that there were crucifixions happening, and then comes up with the idea to say, okay, we can't ever beat the Romans. So we can't have a Messiah who is, a war leader or something like that. But we still have to have a Messiah because the scriptures say so.
Right.
So what is this telling me? And then, of course, you've got the other Hellenistic influences around him of other gods who you don't see, or your great leaders, but they're in the sky. They're these other saviors at the same time. So then, it doesn't take that much for him to piece all these things together and create his own cult, his own conspiracy. And I think this is an existing cult. They already had, they were Jews already. They didn't even consider themselves to be separate. They were still Jews. They were just the true Jews from their own perspective. So yeah, you can piece this together. And of course, Christians still do it now. They still say, look, this is a prophecy. This is a prophecy. Somebody told me there were something like 200 prophecies of Jesus. So, well, they're digging the hole for mythicism there.
Yeah,
They're basically saying you can build Jesus out of the Old Testament.
it is so funny you say that. Good point. I used to, find Jesus in the Old Testament, and you find this angel of the Lord countless times appearing to people, appearing to Joshua, appearing to Abraham. And what? Well, you have the two other people with this angel of the Lord, which is the Trinity. There's always this funny way of people trying to incorporate their thoughts, which is obviously a later idea. But you have the angel of the Lord appearing to Abraham, and he's like, "But Lord, what if there's 50 righteous? Oh, I will spare. I will spare the city if there's 50 righteous," which is why the whole point they take out Lot and his family. You go on. You have Samson's parents, right? The angel of the Lord appears. They thought they were dead, and all of a sudden, they're like pinching their skin and do not let him drink from the vine and all this stuff. And he's a Nazarite, right? Well, and on and on. You look and you find this Jesus guy, and you go, well, he wasn't named Jesus in these situations, but he's the angel of the Lord. And then you find that we have Jehovah's Witness today, and they're out there talking about the Michael Archangel is the Jesus guy in the New Testament. And you go, what? Why do they think that? And if you listen to their arguments to try and see how they piece Jesus to this Michael Archangel that we find in, I believe it's in Daniel, here there might be a connection between this character in Daniel, this angel, and the angel of the Lord being Jesus in the New Testament, and that he lowers himself from his heavenly abode and takes, beneath the angels and humbles himself and becomes like a man and all this stuff. It makes
You have Melchizedek as well. You have the legend of Melchizedek, which is a great example, because then it's the high priest making a sacrifice in the temple in the heavens, which fits that. You've got the mention of the name Jesus in Zechariah as well. So there's lots of these pieces that if you're of a conspiracy theorist kind of person, you could piece together. And of course, we know that's pretty much what was going on in first century Judea anyway. There were people trying to make these prophecies work because there were so many failed prophecies, particularly in Daniel, which was still fairly fresh at the time. Daniel hadn't been written that long ago. So they were trying to make it work. And it does make sense that the surviving sect was a non-militaristic one, because obviously they just didn't have the manpower or the even the technology to crush the Romans. So the only way they could make their theology work was to do this in a non-violent way. And there was many different sects. They went down many different paths. It just happened to be that this particular one ended up winning. And this is what we're left with, trying to piece back together through the many twists and turns that the texts have taken, and how we've lost 99% of everything that was ever written on Christianity.
Yeah, this. I love digging into this question, and the more we get like the Christians in our thinking, but coming at it skeptically, you start to see why this Jesus may not have existed. Bart Ehrman starts with, well, now there's a core guy, all that stuff. Let's just get rid of the fictional stuff and keep the real. And you got to ask yourself, where is the real? I told Dr. Bob the other day, I was on the phone, we were chit-chatting, and I said, that guy is the greatest brain surgeon in the world if he can really uncover the actual guy. Because when you look at him, you find more than just that guy, in my opinion. You find elements taken from other places, like you talked about with Homer and the Iliad, right? Okay, well, let's get rid of that. That's legend. oh, that's Old Testament rehash or midrash, the copy and typology of Old Testament
Yeah,
story.
it's almost all Old Testament, and Matthew's not even subtle about it. Or Paul. Paul keeps saying, "Yeah, we got this from Scripture." So you take it all away, and what's left?
Who is this guy other than, like you said, Old Testament? It's funny because yeah, when you get down to it, you even have Josephus, in my opinion, being used. I do think there's some tagging off there with the three guys. There could be a similarities between the three crucified and Josephus, but I don't think that was solely stolen from there. Even though I do think
Oh,
there's
the two
elements.
survivors, is that where Josephus's friends, where he got them back off the cross to try and rescue them?
Yeah, it was only
I
one
think there's
survivor. Both the friends
the
actually
parallel
die.
though for me is Jesus ben Ananias or Ananias. Of course, the trial seems to match his, where he didn't speak out in his defense, which
Hmm.
is it's pretty suspicious. And with that in recent memory as well, with the fall of Jerusalem.
And then
So
on that note with Jesus ben Ananias, you also have him being the woe saying Jesus, and look in the Gospels, you find him going, and woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, and well, that woe saying Jesus from Josephus does the same thing. But then with the whole crucifixion thing, you can look at the three crucified and say, okay, well, only one actually lives in the end, even though he dies. In Josephus, the three that were taken down that were Josephus's buddies, and this is written in the life of Josephus, his autobiography, um, that two of them died under a physician's care, but one of them actually survived under this, like from the brink of death, he survives. Well, if you look in the Old Testament, even though you can use that as an example for the crucifixion point. So what I'm saying is if there's anything that's being taken here is the fact that there's real crucifixions, and all you got to do is go to Josephus to find contemporary usage of such ideas. Oh, well, crucifixions happened. Here's Josephus. Let's use crucifixions in the story. However, we need to copy the Old Testament. So now go to Joseph in the Old Testament in the dungeon. He's now sold into slavery. He's in Potiphar's house, Pontius Pilate's control. If you look at the story of Matthew 27, you'll find when Judas sells off Jesus with 30 or 20 pieces of silver, it's the
I
same
think it's
thing.
30 pieces, isn't it?
I think it's 20 because the Old Testament story with Joseph is 30. There was a difference in the number of
Yeah, I
silver.
might be thinking of the other story. Yeah.
Yeah, they're not identical, but you
But
can
in either
tell.
case, it didn't make sense because it wasn't worth anything.
Yeah, he throws it down in the temple, but when you go to the Old Testament, it's funny in I think it's Genesis 37, and it's Matthew 27. So parallel this from Genesis 37 up to 41. In Genesis 37 to 41, in that area with Joseph's story, you'll see that Judah, the brother Judah, comes and gives him the idea to sell him off because he didn't want him to die. He just wanted him to sell him off. Well, they get the silver, they sell him off, they take him off to Potiphar's house in Egypt. They sell Joseph. Joseph ends up getting accused by the wife, and sure enough, being accused by the wife, he gets thrown in the dungeon, and there he is in death, so to speak. He hears two men. One of them had a dream about bread and didn't understand it, and the other one had another dream. He was the wine bearer. You have the bread and the wine right here. Okay, what's going on? Eat of my flesh, which is the bread of life, and drink of my blood, which is the wine. Now, what's interesting about this parallel tying into the Old Testament is one of the men was going to be resurrected unto eternal life. One of the men was going to be resurrected unto eternal death. The bread man gets resurrected or brought up to Pharaoh, and then he's condemned. He gets beheaded, and the birds eat of his flesh. He dies. The other one gets resurrected and gets reinstated in his position, serving wine to Pharaoh. You have the body and the blood of Jesus right here in this Old Testament story, so to speak, and you have Joseph literally being seated at the right hand of Pharaoh. Jesus gets resurrected, seated at the right hand of his Father. So you gotta kind of go, what's the big picture saying here? Is this real history in the New Testament? The more you find out it's in the Old Testament, the more you gotta scratch your head and go, I don't know if this is really mythologized history. It's so much copying of the old. How can you really say this is real? You know?
Well, and with the parallels as well, I think there's a lot of focus on crucifixion itself. The Roman style of crucifixion, which isn't necessarily warranted as for what Paul says, because if you read Paul, there's no actual mention of Roman crucifixion. And the term that's used doesn't necessarily mean like the old T-shaped cross thing. It's just hanging in general. So it can be somebody stoned and then hung from a post, or somebody impaled. There's so many different methods, and there wasn't really a standard way to do it. It was just kill someone by sticking them on a pole, because they each just left it to their own precincts, their own ideas. So it's something that's consistent even with stoning. So if you just had Paul and you didn't have the Gospels, and that is a huge problem, is that people are introduced to the Gospels before they read Paul, and they come into Paul with all these preconceptions. But if you had Paul without the Gospels, you could easily say Jesus was stoned, because it's consistent with that as well.
Good point. I think in Acts, the beginning of Acts, if I'm not mistaken, doesn't it say Jesus was hung on a tree? And they do it on purpose because the law says, "Cursed is every man who hangs on a tree." So did he hang on a tree? Well, Derek, the cross post is made from a tree. That's the argument I get Christians who always come back at me, and I kind of go, but what if he was really like on a tree? And then I've seen pictures of other pagan myths where their gods are actually hanging on a tree.
You've got Dionysus, you've got Odin.
Odin, yes, and he hangs on. He kind of there's an involvement of a spear as well in Odin's situation.
There is a spear, yeah, Odin's spear. I'm not sure how old that myth is, so I'm not sure how that got mixed together. So I wouldn't be able to say.
Even if, and with what you're saying, a lot of people go, well, it has to predate Christianity for it to matter. Like the death blow has to be that these myths all have to go before the Christianity myth, or else they don't work. Huh?
You also get people making assumptions, like with the whole crucifixion thing, where they're going, the crucifixion narratives. We're saying, well, it's any form of hanging up after death, or hanging as a form of punishment, as a warning. Basically, humiliating a corpse is what's going on. So any form of humiliating a corpse in public, that's pretty much the point. It's saying that what's the most humiliating death we can come up with? What's the worst someone could go through to be the greatest sacrifice? And the nature of any mythology with gods is to be the best, is to be the top. So you want your sacrifice to be better than all the other sacrifices. So it makes perfect sense to use that method. And yeah, it's interesting that Ehrman says that Paul is trying to come to terms with Jesus having died that way because he's familiar enough with the Old Testament to know that that man would be cursed. And I'm not sure I read that into Paul. I think that might be Ehrman taking his own narrative of Paul walking into a situation in which a real man has been crucified. I think obviously that Paul has come into a situation where they're telling him that they had visions that Jesus was crucified or was hanged, and then he's making his own theology out of that. And I also think that Paul is coming in with a guilty conscience. So from my own perspective, Paul's conversion, it's impossible to say whether he really had a vision, whether he had a guilty conscience which tipped him over the edge, whether he was in it for the money, because obviously there's money involved. He even argues to say, I need to be paid. It's impossible to tell. We can't tell because we're getting only Paul's perspective. So with that in mind, my personal preference for that is I think that he was genuinely hunting Christians, because he admits to that. And I think that he learned enough from them to think maybe he was on the wrong side of this, and then decided to change sides. Whether there was a real vision or not, I don't know. But it seems like a guilty conscience and his predisposition towards religious thinking anyway just tipped him over that edge.
It's interesting going back to the method in which he dies. That alone has so many question marks on it because of the issues. Like, are they really going to have a secret trial on the eve of Passover at night and then be willing to go on Passover day to present him to Pontius Pilate and to be out here parading the streets instead of focusing on Yahweh and focusing on the Passover, which, if I'm not mistaken, has them inside with the blood of the animal on the door that they're supposed
Well, it was illegal to crucify, to kill someone on Passover. It was illegal to have a trial, a capital trial, the day before Passover. It just wouldn't have happened. They would have left him in the cells and dealt with him later. So yeah, all of that is fictional. The gospel accounts are completely fictional.
Right.
You go back to the early source, there is no trial.
Right. That in Paul, and that's what kind of gets me is like, if there was a guy named Jesus, and it was done by Jews, okay, if the Jews really did crucify him, I don't think they would have crucified him. I think the punishment of death would have been stoning. But then again, that depends on if you take the suspected gospel narrative that he claimed to be God in certain situations, which would make him blaspheme, or at least equate himself equal with his father at points, even if you say he wasn't trying to be God. He was doing some blasphemy. Therefore, now at this point, they're actually required to stone him to death. And then another thing is, if he is this sacrifice, where's the burnt sacrifice? There, he's the final lamb. He's supposed to be burned. Is he? Could he be a typological archetype for Israel? And look at what happens in the temple. The temple, where the sacrifice is supposed to take place, ends up burning as a burnt sacrifice. So I don't know where this goes, but human sacrifice never seems good. But it's an interesting idea to rabbit trail into these ideas because nothing is for certain,
Well, I don't like going too far into the Gospels just because I think they're irrelevant. In that they're so fictional that even if Jesus existed, the Gospels could still be totally fictional. So I think disproving the Gospels as history is kind of already been done. It's not something that we need to concern too much about when we look at whether Jesus really existed. So with that already done, we then have to turn our attention to Paul. And Jesus, basically stands or falls on Paul, on how you read Paul. And if you don't read the Gospels back into Paul, because obviously we have to discard the Gospels, then you end up with a very ambiguous reading of Paul. And I think that's where it sits. So it's easy to dig in the Gospels and find holes and go down that road. But I ultimately think that leads nowhere with the question of whether Jesus existed, unless you're debating with someone who considers the Gospels reliable or is a Christian or something like that.
Good point. Yeah, Paul's where we should sit, at least if you agree with most critical thinkers, critical scholars that suppose the first 7 or these 7 books are authentically Paul. I totally agree, and we need to try and find that out. But there's some interesting things even in there that make me wonder, as I've studied so far, and I haven't read all of Dr. Bob's book, which is why I really, really need to. But there's things in there that Paul, in my opinion, shouldn't know, or he's speculating, or he knows something, he knows too much, meaning this guy is obviously in communication with people who are aware of something. One of the reasons why I mention this is that the cup filling up with wrath that we see in 1 Thessalonians, I believe it's chapter 4 or 2, I can't remember. He knows that the wrath is about to be poured out on these people, that their wrath has been full. The cup is full and it's about to pour out on them. If that could be an interpolation.
Well, we already know there was an interpolation in 1 Thessalonians 2. 14 to 16, I think. So we already have a case where we definitely know people have been messing with the text. And of course, for every interpolation we find, there must be, potentially a dozen that we don't know about. Just because they slip under the radar, we have no way of telling. This is why we have to treat these texts with such suspicion.
That's what it boils down to. I love that you bring that up, man. And I'm glad that you came on here to talk about this, because really what we need to do is ask more questions, and I really think that the approach that we're taking is the best one. Who knows, in 10 years from now, we might be convinced by something that leads us to the conclusion, hey, there was a guy, and we don't know much about him at all. We do think there was a guy, and here's what. But at least being as critical as we are, I think for us to get there, if we're going to get there, hopefully we're sticking to something solid that we can prove a case for why we would go to that position, rather than just supposing or starting with he existed and then trying to work our way out of it and find out what is and what isn't true. I like this because at least if we do come to the conclusion that there is, we'll have some solid evidence. Christopher Hansen, for example, came on the show with Dr. Bob. Smart man. He knows a lot. He's read a lot. However, he's jumped the bandwagon like wholeheartedly to the opposite spectrum of historicity. Now, my question is to him was, who's your Jesus? And he's a man who claimed to be God. And Dr. Bob, when I've had conversations, says, wow, that's a very very radical position to say that you knew there was a Jew who claimed to be God in the first century, because that goes against everything that they would do as Jews. So, it just is so, the playing field is all over the place with this for brilliant thinkers that just get caught up in these things. And it's like, let's just remain a skeptic and say, it's possible he was a man who claimed to be God, but let's rule out the possibility. What's the probability? Let's deal with evidence and see what we come up with. Where does he do that in Paul? Where does he claim to be a god in Paul? And I think that's just an answer. They're trying to say, well, why was he killed to begin with? Why would they want him to be killed? What's the motivator?
Like Mark's gospel trial doesn't make any sense as to why Jesus was killed. Yeah, he doesn't even blaspheme in there when they say it's blasphemy. So it really doesn't make sense. I was talking about Hansen. I think he probably has got one of the best chances of writing an actual case for historicity. The impression I get is that he's still, young and exuberant and overconfident. So I'm sure as you go through, if he manages to do his PhD, that'd be great, because obviously the more you learn, the less certain you become. You pick up a bit more doubt as you go along. You start to realize there are so many areas of ambiguity. So I think that's coming along well. I did critique one of his book that he'd written, and he's blocked me since then, so I can't debate with him right now. But I'm sure it happens from time to time. I'm sure he'll come around and we can have our debates again. But he was one of the best at arguing for historicity. In an overconfident way, but I think he'll probably soften up as he gets further on into the material. And this is something which we really need. We need someone to argue for historicity on a logically sound footing, because what we've got is people asserting confidence which is not justified. And you could so easily make a good case for historicity. It's just that they overreach in most cases. So I'm waiting for this one sensible, measured defense. One that actually answers the problems raised by Carrier's book, for example, and by Price. So it would be really good to have the best case for historicity, and I want to see that. And I want to be able to put that side by side and go back and forth and go, here's the best arguments for both sides, read both. This is something that Carrier's been saying for a while, and despite it being, 5 years since On the Historicity of Jesus came out, there's been no solid response to it.
I've seen nitpicking, but never let's come back with something strong. Let's give a total wipeout, destroy what's been built here and annihilate it. I think they just, a lot of them haven't taken it serious like they should. With that being said, when Christopher is ready, I am friends with Christopher. In fact, when it comes down to it, man, I don't care. It doesn't matter, because Santa Claus is not really going down my chimney anymore. He used to, even though he didn't, he did. It's kind of weird, looking back at things. And I like to be cynical amongst those who are like me. I would never go out of my way to try and harm anyone who is of faith, because I understand where they're at and I respect that. I do. But I think it's fun to be able to jab at where I once was and say, man, I was drinking that Kool-Aid. It was so strong.
It's like seeing your young self, isn't it?
It is. And also, it really gives me patience, though. It gives me patience with people. My family, for example, I love them to death. They don't think anything like I do. They are fundamentalist at heart. My dad's still a Roman Catholic at heart. And they pray for me all the time, and I just love them to death. And I'm so glad someone cares enough about me to think about me, But when it comes to these things, I'll have Christopher come on and do shows on our show so that he could present his historical Jesus unbiased from me. Like, there will be no... this is the thing about MythVision. We're not here to pick you apart. We're not here to critique you. We may apply pressure at times. As our show develops and grows, we'll apply some pressure. But to allow the inquisitive mind of whoever's coming on to present their case, only to let them better further what they're trying to present. We're not judgmental on where your approach is coming from. We want you to be able to come on and present that view with feeling like you have a cooperative team to try and pick and mine the brain of the person presenting it, and to allow them to bring it on. And there's some radical people we have on that a lot of people don't even, they debunk and say, nope, I absolutely discredit this guy. We don't even need to waste our time. MythVision's not about that. I mean, we do draw lines where we want to interview people based on our own personal what we want to do, but we're not going to go out of our way to try and pick holes apart. I would like to see him come on though and talk about this thing you're talking about here. Maybe I'll do it soon and say, where are you at so far? Tell us about your journey. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, it'd be interesting. I really like listening to Chris's speech. It's just that he does cross the line occasionally, and ironically goes down into insults, which is what he critiques Carrier for. Mm-hmm. It's quite funny watching. Quite often, the two of them actually do the same thing. They both insult other people and then complain that both of them insult other people.
I stay away from it, man. I don't. I think it's best to stay out of the line of fire in those situations. I mean, look, I get it all the time in my messages on this video. This video might get some, by the way. But I agree with you that I think we should just try to back up. I think there's too many emotions involved in this thing. And once you've deconstructed, I don't understand why there's such an adamant, toward one another. The only thing I can think of is follow the money when it comes to scholarship, because now you're competing with what I'm producing and who's going to get the limelight. It's like this battle that goes on there. It shouldn't be like a belief system. This shouldn't be like, my doctrine's true, yours is wrong. Here's why. If Jesus did exist or didn't, I'm just going to say it. It might hurt my monetization. I don't care. Who gives a shit? Ultimately, I'm saying it's fascinating.
It's definitely something where if anyone's asserting certainty on either side, then you can discard their opinion effectively because they're not being unbiased about it. They're emotionally involved. And also, regardless of whether the historical Jesus or mythical Jesus wins out in terms of historical method in the end, both of them debunk the Jesus of faith. So faith doesn't even enter into it. Like when people are arguing for historical Jesus, and this is something that Christians do. They say, look, even this atheist believes in the historical Jesus. They're not believing in the Jesus of faith. That's gone. It's already the least likely option. Just by definition, that's how supernatural works.
Yeah, they're doing strawman though. They'll use things like Bart Ehrman in their videos, not realizing. And I've seen these great videos too, man. They edit them so good. They'll have these great like cinematic 15-minute videos where it's like proving Jesus is Lord, and then they'll have these Bart Ehrman quotes, and then if I wanted to pick that video apart, I can take the quotes they had from Bart Ehrman and use it against the very point they're trying to make in their video against their own thesis the whole time. And it's we all have done that at times, I suspect, used people to try and get to our points, but I'm trying to remain a skeptic, man, and I think you are too, and we're trying to figure out what's going on, but we don't have a good reason to believe what we've been given is sufficient to just nail this case shut. If anything, the case is opened more and more as we continue to research, because we're coming at this from so many different angles. It's not just that Paul's skeptical, it's that there's also this interesting, in my opinion, there's an astrological root to a lot of these things, in my opinion. There's somewhat of what seems to be celestial. I mean, it really ties into the same vein of what Carrier and Bob have been doing. Price, Dr. Bob, Dr. Carrier. They have been talking about the celestial Jesus, okay? What I've been thinking is, let's look at it astrological in nature. You've got him coming on by a star. You have, and this is gospel stuff. So let's not even look at gospel stuff, so to speak. Okay, if Paul's Jesus is celestial in nature, and he is mystery school related, could he not be doing similar astrotheological things that we do hear about? I'm not going zeitgeist. I'm saying there may be some root here to an astrological basis for this Jesus rather than literal.
You've got this significance of the number 12 often comes up, which is, the thing is, there's so much astrology in Judaism itself that even if you do have astrological parallels, then they're probably coming from Judaism anyway, because just the sheer diversity of Judaism at the time and the way it was something of a cultural hub, trade center where you get lots of different religions coming through. It was probably the most mellow they've been for all their history. because they used to, or they used to talk about stoning people from the wrong religion and all that sort of thing, like Deuteronomy 13. If take the entire city down if somebody says they don't believe in God, that sort of thing. They didn't do that anymore so much. I'm sure they still stoned people, but they were more cosmopolitan at the time. So yeah, it's definitely something which is worth investigating. But the key, I think, is to stay somewhere near the middle. Yeah, there's I started out as full historicist when I started looking into this, then went full mythicist, and then sort of started swinging closer to the middle when I realized just, although I don't think there's good evidence for Jesus, the evidence that we've got is so poor we can't tell. So I lean on the mythicist side. But yeah, I can definitely say the real answer is nobody knows. We have no idea whether he existed or not. We can only take probabilities and work out whether we lean in one direction or the other. So people who are near the middle are the ones who have thought it through, I think.
There's so much to learn. Thanks for joining me on this show, Joel. So any closing statements you'd like to make?
Nothing in particular. It's been a pleasure, and I'm sure we'll find more specific things to discuss later. I just wanted to keep it broad as a first stab.
You're absolutely right. I think we did a pretty good job on being broad to some extent and showing a couple different things. I mean, there's so much more we haven't talked about. And be sure to go check him out on his channel. You've got your YouTube channel as well. You don't plug as often as you'd like, I'm sure, but go subscribe, check him out.
Not just mine, but it's a religious debate group. But I tend to get involved most.
Yeah, the Mythicist group, correct?
So there's a Facebook group which is discussing mythicism, and what we try and do is keep it no faith-based arguments, just history. Try and keep the logical fallacies down to a minimum so that we actually have some genuine discussions between people who respect each other. And on the whole, I think we do a good job of that. The YouTube channel, I've mostly done religious videos because it's based on a religious debate group, but we've done a few on historicity as well. So, bit of a mix.
Interesting. Well, thank you for joining me, guys. Like, share, subscribe to this channel, and your host, Eric Lambert.